Okay, we'd like to turn to the book of Isaiah, chapter 6. Read the first 8 verses, very familiar passage. Isaiah chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it, that is above the throne, stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he did fly. And one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with the tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my mouth, and said, Lo, this hath touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged. Also I heard the voice of the Lord, saying, Whom shall I go, and whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then said I, Here am I, send me. What we read here is Isaiah's record of a real event, something that he personally experienced in his life. It's the record of Isaiah personally seeing, hearing, feeling, and experiencing God in his life. And this is an ongoing and desperate need for God's people today. What we read here is the motivation, the power for correct and continuous service to the Lord. I believe when this took place that Isaiah was already a faithful servant of God. He had been actively engaged in the Lord's work in very trying and difficult, challenging, confusing, and dangerous times. A time of national crisis. King Uzziah had died, and he was a good king. And his service all comes back to what we read here. What we read here is foundational to a life of continual, faithful service to the Lord. You can read verse 1. I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up. And then you can go down to verse 8, and you see the end result. Here am I, send me. And I believe that will be the result when we see the Lord. So our text ends with Isaiah saying, Here am I, send me. Those are words of surrender. Those are words of submission to the Lord. Those are words of willingness and readiness to do the work of the Lord regardless of what it is. Doesn't matter what it is. Here am I, send me. These are the words of one who is available right now to the Lord. These are the words of one who sees the service of the Lord as the priority and as greater than oneself. These are the words of love and devotion to the Lord. Words of great passion and zeal. Here am I. Send me. Words of sincerity. Words of purpose. And what led to this? What led to this is what Isaiah saw. What Isaiah heard. What Isaiah felt and experienced that day. And what Isaiah heard and saw and felt and experienced that day was the Lord. Was God as God. Saw Him high and lifted up. In this message we want to notice Isaiah's personal experience with God, how it occurred, what it achieved. So our subject is the personal experience of the loftiness of God. In our text, God grabbed the attention of Isaiah in a very special way. And oh, how we need that today. For God to grab our attention in a very special way. You look around, just at God's people. God doesn't have the attention of most of them. They're oblivious. Oh, that God would grab our attention. From our text, it's obvious that Isaiah had gone into the temple. And it was there that Isaiah would have this personal meeting with God. And it would be a meeting that would have an impact upon the rest of his life. It would be something that would enable him to maintain his passion and zeal in the service and in the cause of the Lord. And it is what Isaiah experienced that we so desperately need today. So the first thing we want to consider is Isaiah's initial experience. First of all, it needs to be recognized that what he experienced that day was very personal. It was a very personal experience. And Isaiah here in Isaiah 6 is recounting that event. And in doing so, he uses first-person pronouns. I, me, mine, my. 13 times. 13 times. 3 times he uses second-person singular pronouns. Thy and thine. So that's 16 references in these 8 verses that Isaiah makes to self. So everything we read here is personal. It's a first-hand experience. It was experienced by Isaiah individually. It was a reality to him. And as you read the account, he speaks in very certain terms. He speaks in explicit terms. Again, Isaiah was serving God in a profane, godless, secularized culture. And one of the greatest needs of our day is what we read here in our text. We read in verse 1, I myself, saw. I saw with my own eyes. Verse 5, he says, for mine eyes have seen. Or again, I have seen with my own eyes. Reading through the account, it is obvious that what he saw, he also deeply felt. He saw, he felt, he experienced the Lord. John 12, verse 41, these things said Isaiah when he saw his glory and spake of him. It's referring to what we just read. So I believe what Isaiah saw was Jesus Christ. And he refers to Christ throughout the book of Isaiah. He refers to Him as Emmanuel. He refers to Him as the mighty God, the Prince of Peace, our strength, our song, our salvation, the sure foundation, the hiding place. He's the rivers of water in a dry place. He's the suffering servant in Isaiah. He's the divine substitute. He's the sin bearer. He's the offering. And on it goes. And Isaiah here says in verse 5, mine eyes have seen the King. Mine eyes have seen the ruler, the monarch, the potentate. Mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord, all capital letters, meaning Jehovah, the forever self-existent one. He refers to Him as the Lord of hosts. That is the absolute sovereign one. He's explaining what he saw. Again, what he saw, he also personally felt. If we're going to faithfully serve God, we need to see the Lord in such a way that it impacts our entire being. Without that, we will not faithfully serve Him. We will not. This has to happen. We see that he saw, felt, and experienced Christ's position. Notice verse 1, he says, I saw the Lord sitting. A picture of dwelling and abiding in a spirit of calm. I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne. He's sitting upon a place of authority, a place of rule, a place of dominion. And then he describes the place of the throne, high and lifted up. Again, King Uzziah died. And this was a time of national uncertainty when Isaiah needed something from God. And we hear him as he says, I personally saw. I felt, I experienced the Lord as the Master, as the ruler, as the forever one, as the absolute sovereign one. And He's in His rightful place, above all, higher than all, greater than all. And Isaiah saw that. And he felt that as well. He also saw, felt, and experienced Christ's person. Verse 1 again, and His train filled the temple. The train there speaks of the border of the lower parts of His robe. And he says it filled the entire temple. It's indicative of His dignity, His beauty, and His glory. And he says the train filled the temple. That which was indicative of His beauty and glory was so immense, so broad, that it just kept going and going and going. There was no end to it. It filled the temple. And since Isaiah was in the temple, that means that Isaiah was literally surrounded. by this which is indicative of the dignity and the beauty and the glory of the Lord. It was something he could see. It was something that he could feel. In addition, he also sees some activity around the throne. Verses 2 and 3. And this activity involves some seraphims, which are angels burning in brightness. And he declares that each one of these seraphims had 6 wings. And he goes on to describe what they do with those wings. He says, with 2 they fly around the throne. And with 2 they covered their feet. And with 2 they covered their faces. The glory of the Lord was so bright, so amazing, so majestic, so powerful, so permeating, that these sinless angels could not look upon the glory of God. Isaiah in verse 3 describes the song of these seraphims. Holy, holy, holy. They are singing of His holiness, which speaks of His purity, His perfection. Most importantly, it speaks of the fact that He's separate and apart from all else. There's no one like Him. Holy, holy, holy. They are declaring the excellence, the magnificence, the marvel, the wonder of His holiness. They're also singing of His sovereign control. They say, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. He's the Lord of all hosts. And they're also singing of His permeating glory. The whole earth, they say, is full of His glory. The volume of the seraphim as they sing, we're told, is of such magnitude that it shakes the doorposts of the house of God. Notice verse 4. And the posts of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Something Isaiah could feel. The doorpost of the house of God shook. And I believe it also shook the very being of Isaiah. We need to see God in such a way that it shakes us, that we feel it. And I don't believe we'll faithfully serve God without that. We need that. He also saw and felt and experienced Christ's presence. Again, verse 1, His train filled the temple. And in verse 4, and the house was filled with the smoke. It speaks of His surrounding presence. Isaiah was encircled by the glory of God. And there was personal exposure. There was personal contact. There was a personal participation. There was a personal awareness of the glory of the Lord. No matter where Isaiah turned, no matter where he looked, there was the glory of God. So under the circumstances of Uzziah's death, at a time, and Uzziah had been king for 55 years. And at a time when Isaiah needed spiritual refreshment, God got the attention of Isaiah. And in doing so, God directed the focus of Isaiah not to an earthly king, not to an earthly location, nor to earthly prosperity or riches. But God directed the attention of Isaiah to Himself. And in doing so, what He was saying is, Isaiah, don't get stuck on Uzziah. Don't get stuck there. God directed the attention of Isaiah to Himself. because God wanted him to know the best place for him to look if he was going to continue in the Lord's service, and if he was going to continually be transformed into the man that he needed to be for God. He needed to have his eyes upon the Lord. The Word of God presents over and over God sitting on his eternal throne, lifted up and exalted above all others, as the sovereign with almighty power, with absolute holiness. Nothing going on outside of his sovereignty. And this is what Isaiah saw. Next, look at the result. This is what he saw. This is what he felt. This is what he experienced. He sensed his own condition. As a result of this, he sensed his own condition. Following what Isaiah personally saw and felt and experienced, notice verse 5. Then, very important word, then. After everything in verses 1 through 4, then. Following what I heard, what I saw, then said I. While all this was going on, Isaiah was in awe. But then we come to then, said I. A personal response. If we see God as He is, we must personally respond to that. Then said I, woe is me. You go back to chapter 5, we're not going to do so now. He used that word woe 6 times in chapter 5. And it was with reference to the sins of the people. It's easy to talk about the sins of everyone else, the wickedness of the times. Let me tell you something. You see God as He is. The first person's sins you're going to see is your own. Your own. We need to see Him. He says, woe, the word means damned or cursed, is me. He sees himself as deserving of God's wrath. He's deserving of the judgment of God. And notice what he says. Woe is me, for I am undone. I am brought to nothing. Oh, how we need to be undone. I am undone. I am brought to nothing. This is brokenness. As a result of seeing, feeling, and experiencing the Lord's person, He is undone. If there were any feelings prior to going into the temple of self-importance, of self-righteousness, of self-sufficiency, it was all undone at this time. And what will take care of self-importance and self-righteousness and self-sufficiency is the sight of the Lord. That'll take care of that. There are no Pharisees who see God. You can't remain in that condition. In this day when so many of God's people are impressed with their form of Christianity, and so impressed with their skills and their talents and their achievements and their so-called advancements, oh, the need to be undone. And this comes as a result of personally seeing, feeling, and experiencing His person. Not only did Isaiah sense what he deserved at the hand of Almighty God, and not only was he brought to feel that he was nothing, he was brought to see and feel the vileness of himself. He says, because I'm a man of unclean lips. He felt himself ungodly. And if you're in the presence of holiness, holy, 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 if you're in the presence of God's holiness, you will feel ungodly and unrighteous and wicked and infected and foul and vile. He knew that what was true of others. He says, I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. He realized that everyone was unclean, but he's focusing upon himself. Woe is me! For I am undone. I am a man of unclean lips. And then notice the next word, verse 5. And, signifying order again, and that there's more. I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. Again, the order is significant. He starts by feeling his own sin. And now he can move on to see the sin of others as well. And when our attention is drawn to God in such a way that we personally see, feel, and experience His person, there will be an instant and painful realization of our own sins. And notice where he starts. He says, I'm a man of unclean lips. Why did he start there? Why didn't he say, I'm a man of unclean hands? I'm a man of unclean feet. Why did he start with the lips? Well, consider what Isaiah was. He was a preacher. He was a prophet. This is where he was most gifted. This is what God was using in his life. This is where he was most useful. And Isaiah sees where he is most gifted and useful. Woe is me. He says, I'm nothing. I'm nothing. He's overwhelmed. And this is a result, verse 5, for mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Without this personal experience of God, people will not know who God is, and they will not know who they are. You really can't know who you are accurately until you know who God is. Oh, we need to see ourselves before a holy God. Next, as a result of seeing this, he sensed personal contact from heaven. We ought to be thankful that God does not bring us to the state where we realize we are nothing, causing us to feel the weight of our sin and then leave us there. That's not where God left him. In verses 6 and 7, we see that heaven made contact with Isaiah. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having live coal in his hand, which he had taken with the tongs from off the altar, and he laid it upon my mouth, and said, Lo, this hath touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged. So there was personal contact. We need some personal contact from heaven. We need it desperately. We see also he sends personal cleansing. Verse 7, thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged. There was a removal of sin. There was a setting free from sin. There was a healing. There was a restoration. As a result, no doubt, there was an inward calm. And there was a harmony with the Lord. Oh, we need a real and personal meeting with God. A meeting in which something is done with our sin, cleansed and purged. So what he experienced here was the grace and mercy of God. But also he, as a result of seeing and feeling and experiencing God, he had a real sensitivity toward God's cause. Notice verse 8. Also, in addition to having seen, felt, and experienced the sovereignty, the glory, the holiness, and the presence of God, and having seen, felt, and experienced what he deserved from God because of his sin, and having seen and experienced contact from heaven through the grace and mercy of God, he says, also, I heard the voice of the Lord. He now hears in a very special way. But notice, verse 8, it's not merely that he heard the voice of the Lord, but notice what it says. I heard the voice of the Lord saying. That is, I heard the voice of the Lord speaking to me. I heard what he said. I didn't just hear his voice, I heard what he said. There's a difference. You can hear a voice and not have any clue what they're saying, but you hear the voice. But he said, I heard the voice of the Lord saying. I not only heard his voice, I heard what he said. Oh, how we need that today. To hear what God says. And here's what he said. Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And Isaiah took that personally. He heard the voice. He heard what the voice was saying. And he took it personally. Notice, then, there it is again. Then said I. Then said I. When the Lord said, whom shall I send and who will go for us? He's speaking of his cause. He's speaking of the cause of God. And Isaiah's response, having no idea what it would involve, said, here am I. Send me. He's volunteering. But he really doesn't know what he's volunteering for. It doesn't matter. It's God's cause. And however God sees fit, here am I. Send me. Isaiah didn't say, well, Lord, what all is this going to involve? Where am I going to have to go? Didn't matter. And when we see the Lord high and lifted up, it won't matter. All we'll be interested in is doing the Lord's work wherever, whatever that might be. The reason people aren't there, here am I, send me, without making a list of qualifications, is because they haven't seen the Lord like Isaiah has. That'll take care of it all. That'll take care of it all. Here am I, send me. He had a personal sensitivity towards God's cause. Oh, how we need a real and personal meeting with God that would cause us to feel the significance, the seriousness, the urgency of the cause of God. He also sensed an all-consuming desire to surrender. Again, verse 8. Then, upon hearing what God said I, here am I, send me. These are words of surrender. These are words of submission to God. Well, I'm trying to surrender. Stop trying. It's not going to work. What you need is to see the Lord. That's what you need. And when you see Him as Isaiah saw Him, high and lifted up, see Him as God, you will surrender. You will surrender to Him. These are words of willingness. These are words of readiness. Again, as we've already said, these are words of someone who is available to God. Today, if God were to stand right here and say, I want to send people to do my work. All kinds of questions, all kinds of hands would go up. Well, Lord, what do you mean? What's it going to involve? What's the pay? What's it going to cost? What about my family? And on it goes. What about my dog? I mean, on and on and on and on it goes. It never ends. They're unavailable. And most of God's people are unavailable today. Isaiah says, here am I, send me. I'm available. And I'm not available because I don't have anything else to do. I'm available because I've seen the Lord. Again, these are words of one who has the Lord as a priority. Words of passion, zeal, sincerity. Here am I, send me. We should always be volunteering to do the Lord's work. Most of God's people, if not all of us, we define what we will do, where we will go, and how far we will go. It's not for us to define it. That's God's business. We just need to say, here am I, Lord. Send me. Here am I, send me. So this is not just a mere decision. It's not just a mere decision. Isaiah has experienced God. And this is the impact of what he has experienced. It's not a decision. If you can just decide to serve the Lord, then you can just decide not to as well. This isn't a decision. It's a result of an impact. Isaiah saw, heard, felt, and experienced the Lord. The result, personal surrender to God. The reason that the lives of so many of God's people are filled with so many trivial options. You see, God's people have filled their lives with options. They've filled their lives with options, so they're never really available. But you see, if we see the Lord as who He is, that leaves no options. That leaves no options. Oh, how we need this real and personal meeting with God. That would cause us to feel the need to say, Here am I. Here am I. Isaiah went to the temple that day. But he didn't leave the same way he went in. He didn't leave unchanged. And how often we leave the house of God unchanged, or even in a worse state than when we came in. But when we see Him, when we feel Him, when we experience Him as He is, God, that changes us. That has an impact upon our whole life. It impacts our whole life. It changes us completely. And we need that. We need it desperately. Again, what we need is a change in Washington. Not really. Well, we do, but that's not the issue. That's really not the issue. What we need is for God's people to get right. That's what we need. What will make the lasting difference is for God's people to see God for who He is. God. And until that happens, nothing really does happen. Everything else is just a Band-Aid. That's all it is. So God help us. God enable us to see Him, to recognize that He is God. High and lifted up. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us in verse of song. Let's all stand.